Well, have a blessed day, my friends, who are coming to visit, view my lecture session. We're going to start our analysis for DCF or discounted cash flow method. I am Debashish Banerjee and would be fielding your queries and questions and my email ID, which is please take a note of the email ID. It's Christ CHRIST dot inspirit INSPIRIT at gmail.com. After each of these sessions, you might make extensive notes on the lectures, and you are welcome to send in your queries on the email. I would be obliged to respond to each one of you, both individually as well as collectively, for the common understanding of the insights that we're going to discuss. Well, friends, coming back to the beginning of the session, please focus on the spreadsheet wherein we look at the parametric analysis of the discounted cash flow, the outflows, and then compare that with the analysis of the inflows. We would need to focus on the parameters first before we move on into the quartiles. So the first component is the working capital, and over here I mentioned it's a consolidated. And what does this consolidation imply? I will revisit this statement consolidation after we have explained each one of the variables within the parameter. So let me start with working capital. The first variable, the working capital, is raw material, which is quite obvious. Then we look into energy, material receipts, sundry short-term creditors, the operating expenses, supply chain expenses, and expenses to realize sales, and financing costs, the short-term debt. Friends, we need to appreciate the fact that the cash flow analysis is usually on a very short timeline in a time series model. Although the span of the time series models can be over the several quarters, it could be as long as 10 or 15 or 20 quarters or even 25 quarters. And when we are doing the projection, we would need to look at some of the peers of the project peers and examine the typical cash flows in the peer projects before we attempt to predict the cash flows in a futuristic time frame. In a sense, cash flow analysis is a part of a time series, and the fluctuations within the time series model will need to be examined in greater detail in order to be in a position to realistically look at what could be the typical values that would be making sense for a given project. So herein we are borrowing some of the absolute values realistically from the peers who are in the given project for a substantially long period of time, and we borrow the figures to create the time series models for our prediction model for our prediction for the future of the project that the investors are putting the money in. You will notice that we are also converting that into the ratio on the working capital as a person expressed as a percentage of the raw material, expressed as a percentage of the working capital. Now, the ratios are far more important than the absolute values because this gives us a relative allocation of resources or outgo of resources, whichever way you look at it. And consequently, our focus areas would essentially revert around the ratios rather than the absolute values. Now, raw material is a critical component in the working capital. And usually, in most of the projects, it occupies a substantial portion of the outgo. In this particular project, this is a representation of the manufacturing industry, something like maybe in the polymer industry where you extrude the polymers to create the pipes, the PVC pipes or HDPE pipes, the high density polyethylene pipes and so on. So this typical balance sheet is fundamentally drawn in from, or this cash flow analysis sheet is drawn in from the plastic industry, and wherein the raw material is typically around 40 to 45%, or it could be even higher, maybe around 50%. So it hovers around between 40 to 50%. And the energy expenses are also substantial. For every $100,000, possibly you have around 21% outgo in terms of energy. So it's an energy intensive company. And then the receipts are low. Material receipts would imply the purchases in a very short time frame required for continuing with the operations. And sundry short-term creditors, the operating expenses, and so on. Then we move on to the next parameter in the outflow, which is administrative expenses. That includes the wages and salaries, sundry salaries and wages, which is 16. It's around 16% in this particular industry. Could be anything plus minus some within a tolerance of 50 to 20%. Now I come back to the statement. The regional statement is a consolidated, primarily because in a typical fund flow analysis, there are some components which might not make the way to the fund flow statement, like expenses to realize sales and the operating supply chain expenses. These are expenses that are normally do not find their way to the conventional fund flow statement, but I have included them in order to make sense of the cash flow analysis in a given time series. And hence I have used the word consolidated to imply that we have brought in some variables which are conventionally not included in a typical fund flow statement in a balance sheet. Now, I would like you to realize, to understand or appreciate the concept of quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, and 4, so on. Primarily in a futuristic plane, when you are expected to predict the cash outflows in a time series or in a timeline, we need to create epochs over 4 quarters. Epoch is essentially a break, reasonably longish a reasonably long time period within the framework that is far more consistent, that narrows down the variations, the random variations within a given cash flow. In a nutshell, what I'm implying is the cash flows are never typically a straight line. They always vary, they always fluctuate in a given time frame and within a certain fluctuation, certain bandwidth. And the bandwidth of fluctuation is far more critical for our analysis than anything else, than any other parameter or any the variable. primarily because this fluctuation on the bandwidth of fluctuation would give us an insight into the level of uncertainty in predicting the outflows, or for that matter the inflows as well. In our understanding so far, we would need to look at quartiles, because not necessarily a financial quarter in the conventional sense, because we are not looking at annuities. We are looking at the complete time series for which the predictions need to be made for the cash flows, and therefore we notionally divide it into epochs, and each epoch is primarily time frame wherein the fluctuations follow a certain pattern, or the bandwidth of fluctuation may hit a certain value, a certain limit, and then move on to the next quartile wherein the fluctuation bandwidth could vary, could increase or could decrease, or for that matter remain constant. So the entire idea is to figure out the kind of fluctuations within the time series of the first quarter and the second quarter, and figure out the level of mathematical compression or extrapolation that is required for these trends. In our cash flow analysis, we would need to look at the trends and do a mathematical, convert them mathematically into an expression where we either compress and make sense of the fluctuation, or we do an extrapolation on an exponential framework, and try, and if the values are far more or less constant over a period of time, or they fluctuate in a very narrow bandwidth, we need to extrapolate by through an exponential expression on the data or on the coordinates being expressed by the cash flow data. Similarly, if the fluctuation is far too unpredictable, far too wide for the matter, then we need to go in for logarithmic compression as a mathematical expression to compress the data and create a trend analysis to make sense of the futuristic dynamics in the influencing the cash flows or outflows. So, of fundamental importance in our analysis of our outflows is the creation of quartiles for a given time series. And in this illustration drawn in from the polymer industry or the so-called plastic industry, we have let's say an outflow of $100,000, and then we move on $125,000 and so on. So it's a progressively increasing outflow over the timeline because of possibly the requirements for creating value. You need to build up the infrastructure, the processes, and therefore possibly the outflow in the initial time series could be larger, could be increasing in the time frame. So that is what is expressed. So you would say that 45% is your raw material cost in the first quarter. The second quarter could be around 44%. The third quarter it is 37%, and the fourth quarter is 44, 45%. So as the processes stabilize and maybe there are some fluctuations in the raw material. Now these are drawn in from historical expectations of the industry. We are setting up the project, we are investing. If you are investing in a certain project or a certain domain, you need to examine the peers in the domain for a substantially long, adequately long time series, and time series models have to be created to figure out the kind of percentage representation in terms of the working capital. So this is what we have done over here. And then if you look at the energy outgo, initially it is 21%, and it went on to become 18%, and then 18%. Then again there was a spike to 24%. Important, the key parameter, the key point of understanding, the riveting point of understanding is to concentrate and focus on the causal links leading to these kind of fluctuations and figure out ways to troubleshoot and minimize the spikes or the variations, and try and lower the working capital over a time period or in the time series and over between quartiles. So if you have this historical data based on the peer experiences, then possibly this is the beginning, this is the first step to draw the DCF, the discounted cash flows, the possible outflows over a time series based on peer experiences, and then bring on your domain experts. The expertise would be required to bring in their knowledge capital, and work around to find solutions for these fluctuations, to contain these fluctuations substantially, and create value. In this process, if you look at the operating expenses, we possibly got 12%, 10%, 8.9, and 8.3. It is fair enough that initially the operating expenses could be a little higher, which are now decrease over a period of time as the maturity progresses in the time series. Then we move on to the supply chain expenses. It could be initially a spike of 10%, then it stabilizes to around 8 to 7%. Similar is the case for the expenses to realize the sales. The financing costs should also come down for the short-term debt, and the creditors will also be lower as the maturity in the project comes in, and the material receipts also reduce substantially. What is more or less important is to focus on the raw material in this case study, in this illustration, where the raw material costs are almost constant, and which is fairly so. And then we look at the energy, which reduces to at certain times because of possibly reduced usage or higher utilization or higher efficiency of the capacities of the operational efficiency is higher, then the energy outgo will be significantly lower. So these are the areas. So possibly the domain experts will now need to focus on containing the fluctuations in the energy, and also now work on improving the operating efficiencies and lower the operating expenses even further to make sense of the discounted cash flow in the outflows. Now, expenses to realize the sales, the financing costs, and the sunrise short-term creditors are strategic initiatives that would require the intervention of Apex management and their expertise in the strategic areas of marketing, branding, and financial engineering. Product engineering initiatives get built into the operating expenses and the expenses to realize sales, because if you are enabling the operations to going for high thresholds of functional improvements in quality, then you need to have better brand equity, and in the value chain you will get to have a fair amount of conversion of sales, of high value sales, and that would put your project into a position of advantage. Summarizing, I would say that where the domain experts would now need to analyze the DCF outflow matrix over quotas based on the peer experiences, and fortify themselves to intervene in the areas where it matters most. In this case, it matters most in energy and in product engineering, productivity engineering, for reducing the operating expenses as well as the expenses to realize saves through better brand equity, and work around short-term debt through strategic initiatives to lower the cost of financing, a very key component in the sustainability of projects, and look at the short-term creditors and the debtors and eliminate debt to a large extent. Control the administrative expenses and not let it increase. For instance, if it is increasing, maybe because of increased hiring, increasing the manpower and so on, in a time series, and in quarter one it got 16%, it got 20% in quarter two, then it's 20% in quarter three, and then it stabilizes to 18%. So obviously this kind of fluctuation would be detrimental to the sustainability of the project. So we need to look around for when you're looking at the outflows and the discounted cash flow method, you really need to have focus on managing the administrative expenses to a larger level of consistency, and will require strategic management to come in over here. So in a nutshell, friends, you will need to focus on what are the areas of concentration in the discounted cash flow method for the outflows. We really need to now draw in from the collective experiences of the peers who have performed well in the industry that you're investing in, and look at the balance sheet figures over a longer time series model, and draw in a chart which is similar to what we are discussing at the moment, and so that we have a fair amount of idea wherein at the point where the experts have to be brought in, the domain experts, the understanding, the knowledge capital has to be brought in to reduce the fluctuation in the outflows during the time series, and bring in more consistency and therefore achieve a higher level of sustainability. I do hope that the insights are clarified to a large extent, and students would be in a position to gain from the presentation. In case of queries or further details, you are most welcome to send me the email, and I would be obliged to answer you. Thank you, and have a nice blessed day ahead. God bless all of you.